The Department of Mysteries was quiet after 9. Hermione liked the quiet. She preferred it. The silence meant no one was asking her questions she didn't want to answer, and no one was looking at her with that terrible, suffocating pity. She sat at her desk in the center of her secure lab. The glow of the enchanted lamps cast long shadows against the stone walls. She rubbed a smudge of ink on her wrist with her thumb, pressing hard into her own skin, but the dark blue mark remained. Half of her pinned-up hair had escaped the clips hours ago, curling wildly around her face. A stack of case files rested on the desk. The top one detailed a report on rogue time-turners. She wasn't reading it. She was trying very hard not to think about him. 11 months. 11 months since Draco Malfoy vanished into the Veil of Death. 11 months of the Ministry calling him a tragic loss. 11 months of the Daily Prophet running glossy, mournful articles about the fallen Malfoy heir, while Hermione spent every night in this exact lab, trying to find a way to tear the veil open. And 3 days since he washed up on the shores of the Black Lake. Alive. Fractured. Missing pieces of his mind. She closed the file with a heavy sigh. The sound was loud in the empty room. She couldn't focus. She hadn't been able to focus since Kingsley's frantic silver links arrived 3 days ago, delivering the impossible news. Her thoughts drifted back to the research notes. The frantic, obsessive arithmancy Draco had been working on before the accident. He had been trying to map the temporal decay of the veil's edge. He wanted to stabilize it. She had called him reckless. They had argued in this very room, shouting over equations until past midnight. A sharp scrape of metal echoed from the corridor outside her lab. Hermione stopped breathing. Her hand shot to her wand. The heavy iron door to her lab didn't just open. It was warded. Blood-locked to her magical signature. But the handle turned. The metal groaned in protest, a terrible screeching sound that set her teeth on edge. The door swung inward, hitting the stone wall with a thud. A shadow stood in the doorway. Hermione stood up. Her chair scraped backwards. She raised her wand, a hex already on her tongue, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The shadow stepped out of the corridor and into the dim light. "Put that away, Granger," a voice said. It was rough. Scraped roar. Familiar. Draco Malfoy stood inside her lab. He looked like a ghost. He was paler than he used to be, a sickly, translucent white. Shadows bruised the skin under his eyes, deep purple and exhausted. He wore a thick, dark sweater that swallowed his frame, and he was shivering. It wasn't a subtle tremble. It was a violent, deep-bone tremor that he was trying and failing to hide. Hermione lowered her wand. The wood slipped in her sudden, sweaty grip. She couldn't breathe. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her voice was too loud, too sharp in the quiet room. He didn't answer right away. He stood perfectly still, save for the shivering, and scanned the lab. His pale eyes tracked the glowing vials on the far wall, the stacked scrolls on the floor, the neat row of cauldrons cooling in the corner. "You haven't moved the archive shelves," he said. His voice sounded rusty, like he hadn't spoken in a year. "You said you were going to move them to the west wall." "Draco," she said. Her voice cracked. He flinched. Just a tiny twitch of his jaw, but she caught it. "Don't," he said. He took a slow breath. "Don't use that tone. I've had 3 days of healers using that tone. Like I'm a glass doll about to shatter on the floor. I won't take it from you. You shouldn't be here, she said, stepping around her desk. Her knees felt weak. You're supposed to be in St. Mungo's. Kingsley said you were in the secure ward. They said you needed absolute rest. They don't know anything, he snapped. He stepped further into the room. He rubbed the thumb of his right hand over his left knuckles. Hard. Over and over. It was a new habit. She had never seen him do that before. How did you get past the wards? She demanded. She forced herself to focus on the practical. If she focused on the fact that he was breathing, that he was standing in front of her, she was going to scream. The ministry is on lockdown. I used to work here, Granger, in case you forgot, he said dryly. The sarcasm lacked its usual bite. It just sounded tired. And your blood wards are sloppy. You still use the standard arithmancy base. I unpicked it in 3 minutes. You shouldn't be walking, she said. You should be in bed. If I stay in that bed for 1 more hour, I am going to throw myself out the window. He stopped moving and locked eyes with her. His gaze was desperate. Frantic. They want to leave it, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The gaps. They say it's a mercy. Hermione stopped halfway across the room. The memory gaps. Yes, he said. He dragged a hand through his pale hair. It was longer than he usually kept it, falling across his forehead. They say the human mind isn't meant to hold what's on the other side of the veil. They say I should be grateful it burned away. That trying to retrieve the memories would cause permanent psychological damage. They might be right, she said softly. They're cowards, he spat. The sudden anger in his voice made her jump. They're healers, she argued, crossing her arms. They've seen what happens when an unspeakable tries to pull a damaged memory out of a shattered mind. It's not a matter of cowardice. It's a matter of brain death. I am already dead, Granger. He yelled. I spent 11 months in a place where time doesn't exist. Where the dead just scream, endlessly. Or maybe they were whispering. I don't know, because I can't remember. All I have is the feeling of it. The cold. He stepped toward her, his chest heaving. It's driving me mad, he said, his voice dropping from a yell to a desperate scrape. He closed his eyes tightly. The shivering seemed to get worse. The quiet. In my head. It's too quiet. There is a hole where 11 months of my life should be, and it's freezing. It is so cold. Hermione pressed her fingertips to her collarbone. She was terrified of him breaking. He looked like he was holding himself together by sheer willpower. What do you want me to do? She asked. Help me get it back. No. The word was out of her mouth before she could think. His eyes snapped open. His face hardened. The vulnerable, desperate boy vanished, replaced instantly by the prickly, defensive aristocrat she knew so well. He took a step toward her. I'm not asking for your permission, he said. You can't force legitimacy. She shot back. Her own defensive instincts flared, meeting his anger with her own. And even if you could, I wouldn't do it. If the ministry healers won't touch those gaps, there is a reason. They are experts in magical trauma, Draco. It could destroy what's left of your mind. There is nothing left. He shouted. The sound echoed off the stone walls, ringing in the quiet lab. Draco swayed slightly. He grabbed the edge of the nearest desk to steady himself. His knuckles were white. He was breathing too fast, his chest heaving under the thick sweater. Hermione took a breath. She forced her voice to go low. Steady. She had to anchor him. You are here. She said. You survived the veil. No one has ever done that. That is enough for now. He let out a harsh, broken sound. It isn't. He looked at her hand resting against her collarbone. Before I went in, he said. His voice was quiet again. Shaky. Before the accident. You were the only one who read my notes. Hermione swallowed. I told you they were reckless. You read them. He insisted, pushing off the desk. He took another step toward her. You understood the stabilization theory. You fought with me about the arithmancy. You know what I was looking for. You are the only person who knows what I was trying to do before the veil took me. And look what happened, Draco. You vanished for almost a year. We thought you were dead. I thought you were dead. Her voice broke on the last word. She hated herself for it. Draco went entirely still. He watched her face. For a second, the anger vanished, replaced by something entirely different. Something soft. I was dead, he said quietly. For all intents and purposes. There was a funeral, wasn't there? Yes, she whispered. Did you go? Yes. I'm sorry, he said. And he sounded it. I need to know what I saw. He continued, taking a step closer. It wasn't a demand anymore. It was a plea. If I don't get those memories back, I'm never going to be able to sleep. I'm never going to be able to close my eyes without feeling like I'm falling backward into the dark. I need the truth. He crossed the remaining distance between them until he was standing just a few feet away from her. The cold rolling off him was physical. It wasn't just the chill of the dungeons. It was a deep, unnatural cold. She could feel it radiating into the air between them. They look at me and they see a miracle, he said bitterly. Or a ghost. Or a problem to be locked in a ward until they figure out what to do with me. You don't. Hermione crossed her arms over her chest. I look at you and see an idiot who doesn't know when to stop pushing. A tiny, sharp huff of breath escaped him. It was almost a laugh. Exactly. He said. So help me push. She studied his face. He was so pale. He was shivering so hard it made his shoulders shake. But his focus remained entirely on her. He wasn't leaving. She knew him too well. He was stubborn. He was arrogant. He was absolutely relentless. If she said no, he would go find someone else. Someone less careful. Someone who would rip his mind apart trying to find the answers. Someone who wouldn't know when to stop. She couldn't let someone else break him. She wouldn't survive it. Sit down. She said. Draco blinked. What? I said sit down, she repeated. Her tone left no room for argument. She turned away from him and walked to the small tea station in the corner of the lab. Before you fall over and give me extra paperwork to fill out. She didn't look at him, but she heard the scrape of the heavy wooden chair being pulled out from the desk. She spelled the kettle to boil, her hands shaking as she kept her back to him and focused entirely on the mechanical actions. 2 mugs. A splash of milk. 2 sugars for him. None for her. As she let the water steep, she stared blindly at the dark liquid, knowing she was breaking every protocol in the Department of Mysteries Handbook and probably several international wizarding laws regarding the treatment of traumatized patients. If Kingsley found out she was harboring him, she would be fired. She didn't care. It was exactly how they used to do this. Late nights. Endless research. The quiet hum of the kettle masking the exhaustion. When she turned back, he was sitting rigidly in the chair. His arms were wrapped tightly around his chest, holding himself together. She walked over and held out the mug. "Drink," she said softly. He reached for it. His hands were trembling so badly he almost missed the handle. When his fingers brushed hers, the shock of it almost made her drop the cup. He was freezing. Like ice water. Like stone left out in the winter rain. It was a terrible, unnatural cold that seemed to seep straight into her bones. Her hands were warm. He didn't pull away immediately. His fingers lingered against hers for a split second, pressing into the warmth of her skin, before closing around the ceramic mug. He pulled the tea to his chest and wrapped both hands around it. He let the heat sink into his skin, his breathing slowing marginally. Hermione watched him for a long moment. She pulled her wand from her pocket. She pointed it at the heavy iron door. "Colloportus," she said firmly. "Colloportus. Colloportus." The heavy locks clicked into place, one by one, sealing the lab. She turned back to him. He was watching her over the rim of the mug. The frantic edge in his eyes had settled into something quieter. Something exhausted and desperately relieved. He looked at her like she was the only solid thing in the room. "We do this my way," Hermione said, sitting down in the chair opposite him. Slowly. "If I say we stop, we stop." Draco nodded once. "Okay, Granger," he said. It was going to be a long night. The next morning Draco paced. He couldn't sit still. If he sat still, the cold started creeping back up his spine, a slow, freezing tide that threatened to drown him. So he moved. He walked from the heavy iron door to the glowing vials on the far wall. 12 steps. He turned. He walked back. 12 steps. Hermione was ignoring him. She sat at her desk, buried behind a towering stack of ancient texts, her wand moving in sharp, precise arcs as she transcribed something onto a roll of parchment. She hadn't slept. He hadn't slept either. He had spent the night alternating between pacing and sitting rigidly in the chair she had given him, drinking cup after cup of the strong, sugary tea she kept brewing. She hadn't pushed him. She hadn't tried to break into his mind immediately. She had just sat there, reading, letting him adjust to the fact that he was actually here, solidly anchored in the physical world. It was infuriating. "Your filing system is atrocious," he said, stopping in front of a haphazard stack of scrolls near the corner. Hermione didn't look up. "Leave my scrolls alone, Draco." "I'm merely observing," he drawled, letting the familiar aristocratic boredom bleed into his voice. It was a defense mechanism. A shield. He knew it, and he was fairly certain she knew it, too. You have 12th century runic translations stacked next to contemporary magical lore. It's a disaster waiting to happen. What if you need to reference a blood ward quickly? I know exactly where everything is, she said, finally pausing her transcription. She looked up at him, her brown eyes sharp and entirely unimpressed. And if you touch that stack, it will collapse, and I will make you resort it alphabetically by author. I didn't survive the literal land of the dead to be lectured on proper filing techniques, Granger. Then stop pacing like a caged weasel and sit down, she shot back. He didn't sit down. He couldn't. His heart was hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs, the terror of physical weight in his chest, heavy and suffocating. They were going to do it. They were going to try the first extraction, and he rubbed the thumb of his right hand over his left knuckles, though the friction did nothing to warm the icy chill settling into his joints. Are you ready? She asked. Her voice softened, losing the sharp edge of their banter. Draco hated that soft tone. He hated that she looked at him with that fierce, protective intensity. It made him feel fragile. It made him want to shatter. I've been ready for 3 hours, he lied. Hermione set her wand down. She stood up, brushing a stray piece of parchment off her robes, and walked to the small wooden table in the center of the room. A shallow stone basin rested there. The pensieve. Its surface was dark and empty, waiting to be filled. Sit, she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. He forced his legs to move. He walked to the table and sank into the chair, keeping his back rigid. He gripped the edge of the wood, his knuckles turning white. We're going to start very small, Hermione said. She didn't sit down. She stood across from him, leaning slightly over the table. We are not aiming for the veil. We are not aiming for anything dramatic. I just want to find a safe, mundane memory from right before you vanished, just to test the pathways. Fine, he clipped out. You have to let me in, Draco. He swallowed hard. I know how legilimency works, Granger. I know you do, she said gently. But you're building a wall right now. I can feel it from here. You have to lower it, or this is going to hurt. He closed his eyes. She was right. He was throwing up every mental shield he had ever learned, a desperate, instinctual attempt to keep the cold locked away where it couldn't hurt anyone else. He took a slow, shaky breath. He forced his hands to uncurl from the edge of the table. He consciously dismantled the first layer of his occlumency shields. Okay, he whispered. Look at me, she said. He opened his eyes. She was right there. Her brown eyes were warm, grounded, and entirely focused on him. Legilimens. The intrusion was immediate, but it wasn't harsh. It wasn't the violent ripping sensation he had expected. It was a gentle pressure, a warm current slipping into the icy corridors of his mind. He tried to hold still. He tried to let her guide the current. But the moment her magic brushed against the edge of the gap, the massive, echoing void where 11 months of his life should be, the cold flared. It was absolute. It wasn't a memory. It was a physical sensation of falling. A deafening, roaring silence that stripped the air from his lungs. Shadows twisted in his peripheral vision, reaching for him, pulling him down into the freezing dark. He panicked. He violently shoved her magic out, throwing his shields back up with the force of a physical blow. The connection snapped. Draco gasped, jerking backward in his chair so hard it nearly tipped over. He was covered in a cold sweat. The lab swam into focus. Hermione was leaning heavily on the table, breathing rapidly. She looked pale. Brilliant. Draco sneered. The sarcasm was a knee-jerk reaction, a desperate attempt to cover the raw terror clawing at his throat. Absolutely brilliant, Granger. You lasted exactly 4 seconds before I had to throw you out. Are you sure you actually passed your NEWTS? She didn't rise to the bait. She just stood there, letting him lash out. Her silence was worse than if she had shouted at him. Say something. He snapped, his voice shaking. It was cold, she said quietly. Draco froze. It was so cold. She repeated, looking up at him. She wasn't angry. She wasn't offended by his insult. She just looked incredibly sad. I barely touched the edge of the gap, and it felt like drowning in ice. He rubbed his thumb over his knuckles again, unable to meet her eyes. I told you, he muttered. I told you it was a void. It's not a void, she said, her voice turning analytical, grounded. It was the tone she used when solving a complex arithmancy equation. It was exactly what he needed to hear. A void is empty. That wasn't empty. That was a wall of compressed magical energy. It's masking the memories. Draco finally looked up at her. Masking them? Yes, she said, moving around the table until she was standing next to his chair. The veil didn't burn them away. It buried them. It's a defense mechanism, Draco. Your own magic is freezing the memories to stop them from overwhelming your nervous system. So the healers were right, he said bitterly. They're dangerous. We shouldn't touch them. No, Hermione said firmly. The healers think the memories are gone. They're not. They're just trapped under the ice. If we chip away at it slowly, we can thaw them out without breaking your mind. He studied her. She sounded so certain. So impossibly confident. You're insane, he said. I'm right. She corrected. Before he could argue, the heavy iron door to the lab swung open with a loud groan. Draco flinched, his hand immediately dropping to his pocket where his wand should be, before he remembered the healers had confiscated it. A tall wizard with a slouching posture and a perpetual smirk strolled into the lab. He was carrying an absurd number of scrolls under one arm and a paper bag in his other hand. Theo Knott stopped just inside the doorway and took in the scene. Draco sitting rigidly in the chair, covered in cold sweat. Hermione standing entirely too close to him, her hand resting on the back of his chair. Theo's smirk widened. Look at you two, Theo said, his voice a languid, amused drawl that immediately grated on Draco's nerves. Death itself couldn't stop the bickering. It's inspiring, really. I was taking bets on how long it would take you to start yelling at each other again. I had 20 galleons on within the first hour. Get out, not. Draco snapped. I bring gifts, Theo said, ignoring the command. He walked over to Hermione's desk and dropped the scrolls with a heavy thud, followed by the paper bag. The archive records you requested, Granger. Illegally procured, of course. And blueberry muffins from the ministry cafeteria. Also illegally procured, because I cut the line. Thank you, Theo, Hermione said, stepping away from Draco's chair. Draco immediately felt the loss of her proximity. The cold crept back in, sinking its teeth into his shoulders. He wrapped his arms around his chest. Theo leaned against the door frame, watching them both with entirely too much amusement. "So," Theo said, popping a piece of muffin into his mouth. "Are we resurrecting the dead, or just giving them anxiety attacks? Because you look terrible, mate." "I look better than you," Draco shot back. "Have you slept this decade?" "I'm an archivist," Theo said proudly. "We run on caffeine and spite. You, on the other hand, look like you're about to pass out." "Granger, are you torturing him?" "We were just taking a break," Hermione said smoothly, moving to the desk and sorting through the scrolls Theo had dropped. "Good," Theo said. He pushed off the door frame. "Don't break him, Granger. I already planned one funeral for this idiot. I absolutely refuse to plan another. The catering was a nightmare." Draco glared at him. "Your eulogy was terrible. You weren't even there to hear it," Theo yelled back, though his eyes were completely entirely fond. "I rhymed Pratt with aristocrat. It was poetry. It was a tragedy," Draco muttered. "Right, well, I have to go alphabetize something dusty," Theo said, waving a hand vaguely. "Don't kill each other. Or do, and I'll collect my winnings." He turned and strolled out of the lab, the heavy iron door swinging shut behind him. The silence settled back over the room. Draco kept his arms wrapped tightly around his chest. The banter with Theo had been a distraction, a brief, familiar normal that had kept the panic at bay. But now Theo was gone, and the cold was back. It was worse this time. It felt like it was creeping up his throat, choking him. He rubbed his thumb over his knuckles again, his breathing hitching. He heard the soft scrape of a chair. Hermione walked back over to the small table. She didn't say anything. She didn't offer any empty platitudes about how it was going to be okay. She just pulled her chair around the table, not sitting across from him this time. She set the chair down next to his, close, and sat down. The heat radiating from her shoulder was an immediate, shocking contrast to the freezing void in his head. She didn't touch him. She just sat there, moving her chair an inch closer, until their knees were almost brushing. The cold stopped creeping up his throat. It didn't vanish entirely, but it receded, pushed back by the sheer, stubborn warmth of her proximity. Draco slowly uncurled his arms. He dropped his hands to his lap, his breathing evening out. "Okay," Hermione said softly, not looking at him, just staring at the empty pensive. "Let's try again." Late night the lab was quiet. The only light came from the luminescent blue glow of the stasis vials lining the far wall and the silvery, shifting surface of the pensive resting on the table between them. Hermione adjusted the angle of the stone basin by a fraction of an inch. She didn't need to. It was a stalling tactic. She was acutely aware of how close they were pushing to the edge of what his mind could handle. They had spent the last 3 days chipping away at the periphery of the void. They had pulled fragmented, harmless memories, the color of the sky the day he vanished, the feeling of the rough stone beneath his boots just before he fell. Nothing substantial. Nothing dangerous. Tonight was different. Tonight, they were going to try to pull a memory from inside the veil. Hermione wiped her palms on her robes. They were sweating. She was terrified. She was an unspeakable. She dealt with abstract, fatal magic every single day. She had stared down curses that could rot a person from the inside out and temporal anomalies that could erase a person from existence. None of it scared her as much as the thought of breaking Draco Malfoy's mind. "Stop fussing with it," Draco said quietly. Hermione dropped her hands. She looked across the table at him. He was sitting in the same chair he had occupied for the last 3 days. He still wore the thick, oversized dark sweater. He was always cold. The shadows under his eyes seemed permanently bruised into his skin, a stark contrast to his pale face. But he wasn't pacing. He wasn't lashing out. He was just watching the silvery surface of the pensive, his expression completely blank. It was the forced stillness of someone preparing for an impact. "I'm not fussing," she lied, her voice dropping into the low, soothing register she had adopted whenever they were near the basin. "I'm making sure the runic containment field is aligned. If we pull something volatile, we need the basin to hold it without shattering. It's aligned, Granger," he said. He finally looked up from the basin, meeting her eyes. "We've been looking at it for an hour. Are we doing this or not?" She pressed her fingertips against her collarbone, a nervous habit she couldn't break. "I don't know if we should," she admitted. The words felt like a betrayal, but she couldn't stop them. "We've only done surface retrieval. Going directly into the void, it could trigger a catastrophic feedback loop. The healers warn the healers don't know anything." Draco interrupted. His voice wasn't angry, just incredibly tired. "They think I'm a lost cause. They think I should just sit in a warded room for the rest of my life and knit scarves. I can't live like this. The quiet in my head is deafening. It's driving me insane." "I know," she whispered. "I trust you," he said. The words hit her like a physical blow. The absolute sincerity in his voice stripped away every argument she had prepared. He didn't trust easily. He never had, not even before the veil. For him to say it now, when he was this fragile, was a weight she wasn't sure she was strong enough to carry. She took a deep breath. She dropped her hand from her collarbone. "Okay," she said, nodding once. "Okay. We do it together." She pulled her wand. She moved her chair so it was directly beside his, their knees almost brushing. She needed to be close. She needed to anchor him physically before they went into the memory. "I'm going to cast the extraction charm," she explained, her voice steady and professional, masking the panic clawing at her throat. "I want you to focus on the cold. Just the feeling of it. Don't try to picture anything. Let the magic latch onto the temperature drop, and it will pull whatever is attached to it." Draco nodded. He closed his eyes. Hermione watched his face. She watched the way his jaw tightened, the way his breathing hitched as he deliberately lowered the occlumency shields he had spent years perfecting. She could feel the ambient temperature in the lab drop as his magic brushed against the void. She raised her wand, pressing the tip gently to his temple. "Eximo," she whispered. A silver thread of memory pulled away from his skin, clinging to the tip of her wand. It wasn't the fluid, glowing silver of a normal memory. It was thick and sluggish, pulsing with an unnatural, freezing grey light. Frost immediately began to form along the wood of her wand. Hermione shivered, forcing her hand to remain perfectly steady. She lowered the wand into the pensieve. The moment the grey thread touched the surface of the basin, the liquid violently changed. It didn't ripple. It turned to ice. A layer of dark, jagged ice shot across the surface of the stone, cracking ominously. Draco opened his eyes, watching the basin. He rubbed his thumb over his left knuckles, his breathing shallow. "It's ready," Hermione said. Her voice sounded thin, stretched tight with tension. "Together," Draco said. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the thick wool of his sweater, and plunged her face into the icy surface of the pensive at the exact same moment he did. The lab vanished. The transition wasn't smooth. It felt like being violently thrown through a wall of solid ice. Hermione gasped, stumbling as her boots hit a surface that didn't feel like a floor. It felt like walking on ash. It was entirely dark, but it wasn't the darkness of a room with the lights turned off. It was a heavy, suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the light entirely. It was a physical weight pressing against her chest, making it impossible to draw a full breath. And the noise. It was deafening. It wasn't screaming, like he had described in the beginning. It was a million voices whispering at the exact same time, overlapping, frantic, desperate. They were speaking every language, begging, crying, demanding to be heard. It was the veil. Hermione covered her ears, but the whispers weren't in the air. They were inside her head, crawling along her thoughts like static. "Draco!" She yelled. She couldn't hear her own voice over the deafening roar of the whispers. She spun around in the dark. He was standing a few feet away from her. He was completely still. He wasn't wearing the sweater here. In the memory, he was wearing the torn, blood-stained robes he had disappeared in 11 months ago. He was gazing blankly ahead into the dark, his eyes completely hollow. He was slipping. The memory was pulling him back into the void. Hermione didn't think. She lunged forward, closing the distance between them. She grabbed his hand. She laced her fingers tightly through his, gripping his freezing hand with desperate, bruising force. The moment their skin connected, the deafening roar of the whispers snapped into complete silence. The change was so sudden and absolute that it left a ringing in Hermione's ears. The crushing weight of the darkness seemed to recede, held back by the point of contact between their hands. Draco gasped, taking a massive, shuddering breath, as if he had just broken the surface of the water after drowning. He looked down at their joined hands. Then he looked up at her. His eyes weren't hollow anymore. They were wide, terrified, and entirely present. "Hermione." He breathed. It was the first time he had used her given name since he had returned. "I've got you," she said, her voice shaking badly. She squeezed his hand harder, anchoring him. "I've got you. Look at me. Don't look at the dark." He studied her. The terror in his face slowly gave way to something else. Something fiercely intense. The memory began to fracture around them, unable to hold the pressure of their intrusion. The darkness cracked like breaking glass, shattering into a million pieces of freezing light. They were violently thrown backward. Hermione gasped as the real world crashed back into existence. She stumbled out of the pensive, hitting the edge of the wooden table so hard it bruised her hip. Draco reeled back into his chair, his chest heaving. The lab was exactly as they had left it. The luminescent blue vials. The heavy iron door. The quiet hum of the wards. Hermione was shaking uncontrollably. The sheer sensory overload of the veil was still echoing in her nervous system. She leaned heavily against the table, trying to catch her breath. Draco was watching her. He was breathing just as hard, his hair messy across his forehead and his eyes dark and blown wide, as he stood up and walked directly toward her, closing the distance between them until he was standing completely in her space. Hermione went rigid. She looked up at him. He was so close she could feel the unnatural cold radiating off his skin, but beneath it, she could feel the frantic, hammering heat of his pulse. He raised his hand. His fingers, still trembling slightly, brushed against her cheek. He tucked a stray curl behind her ear, his thumb lingering on her jawline. The touch was impossibly soft. It was reverent. Hermione stopped breathing entirely. The air in the lab seemed to thicken, heavy and charged with an electric tension that had absolutely nothing to do with the magic of the pensive. His eyes dropped to her lips. He leaned in. It was a slow, deliberate movement, completely lacking his usual arrogant confidence. It was hesitant, desperate. Hermione's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. But just as he closed the remaining inches between them, a sudden, violent shiver racked his entire body. He froze. The phantom chill of the veil hit him like a physical blow. The vulnerability in his expression vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, blinding panic. He flinched back and stepped away so quickly that his leg caught the edge of his wooden chair, sending it scraping loudly across the stone floor and shattering the fragile tension in the room as he turned his back to her, wrapping his arms tightly around his chest to rebuild the walls he had just dismantled. Hermione stood frozen against the table. Her hand was half raised, hovering in the empty air where he had been standing just a second before. "Draco?" she asked, her voice small. "Don't," he said sharply. His voice was clipped, harsh, and entirely shut down. The aristocratic drawl was back in full force, a perfect, impenetrable shield. Just don't. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, shivering in the oversized sweater, entirely unreachable. Hermione slowly lowered her hand. The cold of the lab seemed to seep into her bones, far more chilling than the memory of the veil. She turned away, quietly beginning to pack up the pensive, leaving the space between them completely empty. The corridor, Draco couldn't breathe. It wasn't a metaphor. His lungs were seizing, locking down as if the air around him had suddenly turned to solid ice. He was walking down the empty, stone-lined corridor of level 9, but the ministry didn't feel real. The walls were distorting. The shadows stretching from the sputtering torches seemed to detach themselves from the stone, twisting and reaching for him like long, freezing fingers. He stumbled. His shoulder slammed hard against the wall, but he barely felt the impact. The pain was distant, muffled beneath the roaring static in his head. The veil was leaking. It had started the second he ran from Hermione's lab. The almost kiss had shattered something fundamental in his chest. It had broken the fragile, arrogant shell he used to keep the void contained. He had panicked. He had retreated. But the retreat hadn't saved him. It had only opened the door. Now, the cold was everywhere. He dragged himself forward, one hand sliding along the rough stone wall to keep him upright. He needed to get to the lifts. He needed to get out of the Department of Mysteries. He needed to be anywhere but here. But his legs felt like lead. The temperature in the corridor was plummeting. He could see his own breath materializing in the air, a faint white cloud that vanished almost instantly into the dark. "Stop," he whispered to himself. His voice sounded paper-thin, completely swallowed by the unnatural quiet. "Stop it. You're out. You're out." The shadows didn't listen. They pooled around his boots, thick and suffocating. The whispers started. At first, it was just a low murmur, a collective static that made the hairs on his arms stand up. But within seconds, it escalated. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was 1,000 voices screaming at once, echoing in the space between his ears. They were pulling at him. They were telling him he didn't belong here. They were reminding him that he had left a piece of himself on the other side, and the void was coming to collect. Draco's knees buckled. He hit the floor hard, tearing the thick wool of his sweater as the freezing stone beneath him felt like a block of pure ice. Curling in on himself and pressing his back against the wall, he brought his hands up to grip his hair tightly, squeezing his eyes shut against a darkness that wasn't empty but rather the same heavy, crushing blackness of the pensive memory. He was falling backward into the dark, and there was nothing to catch him. His chest heaved as he tried to draw a breath, but the air was too thin. He was suffocating. The cold was sinking into his bones, freezing the blood in his veins, turning his heart to stone. He rubbed the thumb of his right hand over his left knuckles, a frantic, desperate motion. The friction did nothing. The cold was absolute. Malfoy. The voice was faint, entirely drowned out by the roaring of the veil. He ignored it. It was a hallucination. The void was playing tricks on him, using the one voice he actually wanted to hear to drag him down faster. Draco. The voice was louder this time. It pierced through the static. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Fast. Frantic. He didn't open his eyes. He couldn't. If he opened his eyes and she wasn't there, if it was just the shadows wearing her face, it would break him completely. Then, hands grabbed him. They weren't freezing. They were impossibly, shockingly warm. They grabbed his shoulders, pulling him away from the wall. Draco, look at me. He gasped, his eyes flying open. Hermione was there. She was kneeling on the freezing stone floor, entirely uncaring of the fact that she was ruining her ministry robes. Her hair had completely escaped its pins, falling around her face in a wild, chaotic halo. She didn't ask what was wrong or offer empty platitudes, but instead looked at him with a fierce determination that cut through the panic like a blade as she shifted her grip from his shoulders to grab his face. She framed his face in both of her hands, her palms pressing flat against his freezing cheeks, and the shock of her burning hot skin made him gasp again. Look at me, she demanded. Her voice left absolutely no room for argument. He looked at her. He locked onto her brown eyes like a drowning man grabbing a rope. She leaned forward. She pressed her forehead directly against his. The physical contact was an anchor. It was a sudden, violent tether to the physical world. The roaring static in his head abruptly cut off, replaced by the sound of her rapid, uneven breathing. "You're here," she said, her voice shaking but fiercely uncompromising. "You're solidly here, and I'm not going to let you drift away again. Do you hear me?" Draco couldn't speak. His throat was too tight. He just nodded, his forehead sliding against hers. "Breathe with me," she ordered. She exaggerated her own breathing, taking a deep, slow inhale. He tried to follow. His first breath was a jagged, broken gasp. "Again," she said. Her thumbs stroked across his cheekbones, a grounding, repetitive motion that sent waves of heat through his skin. He inhaled again. It was slightly smoother this time. The shadows in the corridor stopped twisting. The oppressive, freezing dark began to recede, pushed back by the sheer force of her proximity. She wasn't just anchoring him. She was shielding him. Her magic was flaring around them, a warm, golden barrier that the cold of the veil couldn't penetrate. He didn't realize he was moving until his arms were already around her. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was sheer survival instinct. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He wrapped his arms around her waist, holding onto her so tightly he was probably bruising her ribs. She didn't pull away. Instead, she wrapped her arms around his shoulders, holding him just as tightly. One of her hands tangled in the hair at the nape of his neck, her fingers pressing into his scalp. He let out a broken, shuddering breath against her skin. He breathed in the scent of parchment and vanilla. It was the smell of her lab. It was the smell of the late nights they had spent researching. It was the smell of the only place in the world where he actually felt safe. The cold finally broke. It shattered, melting away under the overwhelming heat of her body pressed against his. His lungs unlocked. He drew his first full, clear breath in what felt like hours. The sheer relief of it was exhausting. All the adrenaline drained out of his system at once, leaving his muscles weak and trembling. He sagged against her, his entire weight resting against a shoulder. Hermione held him. She didn't say a word. She just sat on the cold stone floor, holding him together while he fell apart. They stayed like that for a long time. The empty corridor was completely silent, save for the sound of their intertwined breathing. Draco slowly realized what he was doing. He was clinging to her. He was clinging to the brightest, most capable witch in the ministry like a terrified child. The old Draco Malfoy, the arrogant, untouchable aristocrat, would have died of shame. But the old Draco Malfoy was dead. He had died the moment he fell through the veil. The man who had come back was fractured, exhausted, and completely reliant on the woman holding him. He didn't care about his pride or his walls, caring only that she was here, warm, and not letting go. He realized with sudden, devastating clarity that the veil had tried to strip everything away from him: his identity, his magic, his sanity, but it couldn't burn away the memory of her. She was the anchor. She was the only reason he had fought his way back to the living at all. He turned his head slightly, his nose brushing against the soft skin of her neck. "I'm sorry," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, wrecked by the panic attack. "Don't," Hermione said instantly. Her hand tightened in his hair. "Don't apologize. Not for this." "I ran," he said, the admission tasting like ash. "I got scared, and I ran." "I know," she said softly. "It's okay. You're allowed to be scared, Draco. You survived something no one else ever has. You don't have to pretend you're fine." "I'm not fine," he admitted. It was the most honest thing he had said since he woke up on the shore of the Black Lake. "I'm broken, Granger. There's a hole in my head, and it's leaking. I'm a liability." Hermione pulled back slightly. She didn't let him go entirely. She kept her hands on his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. Her brown eyes were completely serious. There was no pity in them. There was only a fierce, stubborn determination. "You are not broken," she said, her voice steady and absolute. "You are injured. There is a difference. Injuries heal. We are going to heal this." "How?" he asked, a bitter edge creeping into his voice despite his exhaustion. The memory extraction almost killed me. The cold. We pushed too fast, she said, cutting him off. That was my fault. I got impatient. I wanted to fix it immediately, and I underestimated the density of the magic surrounding the void. It's not your fault, he argued, frowning. It's my lab, it's my procedure, and it's my responsibility, she said. Her tone broke no argument. It was the same tone she used when managing incompetent interns. It made him want to laugh, despite everything. We will adjust the parameters. We will go slower. But we are not giving up. He stared at her. She was so incredibly stubborn. She was looking at a hopeless case and refusing to accept the diagnosis. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. The question had been burning in his chest since the moment he arrived at her door 3 days ago. Why are you risking your job, your sanity, everything, just to help me? The rest of the ministry wants to lock me away. Why don't you? Hermione's expression softened. The fierce, uncompromising unspeakable vanished, replaced by the woman who had shared late-night tea and endless research with him before everything went wrong. She moved one hand from his shoulder, gently tracing her thumb along his jawline. Because I know you, she said simply. The words were quiet, but they echoed in the empty corridor. I know you, she repeated. I know how brilliant your mind is. I know how much you fought to overcome your past. And I know that if I let them lock you in a ward, the quiet would destroy you. She swallowed hard, her hand dropping back to his shoulder. And, she added, her voice dropping to a whisper, because I missed you. More than I ever thought I would. Draco's breath hitched. He didn't have a sarcastic deflection for that. He didn't have a defense mechanism left. The absolute vulnerability in her confession stripped away the last of his armor. He moved his hands from her waist, sliding them up to frame her face, mirroring exactly what she had done to anchor him minutes ago. Her skin was still warm. He pressed his thumbs against her cheekbones. I missed you, too, he admitted, his voice rough. Even when I couldn't remember my own name, I knew I was missing something important. It was you. It was always you. Hermione's breath hitched. She blinked in surprise, the dark brown irises reflecting the flickering torchlight of the corridor. The tension that had shattered in the lab earlier returned, but it was different this time. It wasn't electric or dangerous. It was heavy, inevitable, and entirely focused on the few inches of space separating them. He didn't lean in. He didn't want to run again. He waited, letting her make the choice. Hermione closed her eyes. She leaned her forehead against his, a quiet, surrendered motion. We need to get you off the floor, she whispered. The moment broke, but the tension didn't vanish. It settled around them, a comfortable, heavy warmth that kept the cold of the veil firmly locked away. Draco huffed a quiet laugh. It sounded rusty, but it was real. Are you saying my aristocratic frame isn't meant for Ministry Stone? He asked, letting a tiny sliver of his usual drawl bleed back into his voice. I'm saying you're heavy, and my knees are freezing, she retorted, opening her eyes. The sharp, familiar banter was back, but it lacked any real bite. It was a safety blanket they were both eagerly pulling around themselves. He dropped his hands from her face, suddenly realizing how completely entangled they were on the floor of a public corridor. Anyone could have walked out of the lifts and found them. He shifted his weight, preparing to stand up. His legs immediately protested. The adrenaline crash had left his muscles feeling like jelly. He stumbled as he tried to get his feet under him. Hermione was there instantly. She stood up, hooking her arm firmly under his shoulder and taking the brunt of his weight. "I've got you," she said, bracing him against her side. "I can walk," he grumbled, though he didn't try to pull away. "Shut up, Malfoy, and lean on me," she ordered, steering them both back toward the heavy iron door of her lab. He leaned on her. He leaned on her more than he strictly needed to, letting the warmth of her shoulder seep through the thick wool of his sweater. They walked back to the lab in silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the void. It was the quiet, steady silence of two people who had finally stopped fighting each other. When they reached the door, Hermione muttered the countercharm, and the heavy locks clicked open. She helped him inside, guiding him not to the hard wooden chair at the table, but to the small, worn sofa in the corner of the room. He sank into the cushions with a heavy sigh, closing his eyes. He heard the soft clatter of porcelain, the familiar hum of a kettle being spelled to boil. When he opened his eyes, Hermione was standing in front of him, holding a steaming mug of tea. He took it, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic. She sat down on the sofa next to him. She didn't sit on the far cushion. She sat close, her thigh pressing against his, anchoring him exactly as she had in the corridor. Draco took a sip of the tea. It was sickeningly sweet, exactly how she always made it for him. He looked at her. She was gazing at the dark surface of the pensieve across the room, her expression thoughtful and determined. He shifted slightly, leaning his head back against the wall. The cold of the veil was still there, a distant, frozen ache in the back of his mind. But it wasn't threatening to consume him anymore. As long as she was sitting next to him, the void couldn't win. He took another sip of tea, letting the warmth spread through his chest. For the first time since he had returned, he actually believed he was going to survive. The next evening, Hermione couldn't focus on the parchment. She was staring at the same line of 12th century runic translation she had been looking at for 20 minutes, but the letters were swimming. Her mind wasn't on the research. Her mind was entirely focused on the fact that Draco Malfoy's thigh was pressed firmly against hers. They were sitting on the small, worn sofa in the corner of her lab. They had been sitting there for 3 hours. The desk was covered in a chaotic spread of open texts, star charts, and the chaotic, frantic research notes Draco had left behind before he vanished. The air in the lab was thick. It was a heavy, electric tension that had settled over them the moment he walked through the heavy iron door that evening. The raw vulnerability of the corridor the night before had changed everything. The walls were gone. The defensive snark was gone. All that was left was this terrifying, undeniable proximity. "You're not reading," Draco said quietly. Hermione blinked, forcing her eyes to focus on the parchment. "I am." She lied, her voice sounding a little too breathy. "You haven't turned the page in 20 minutes, Granger." He pointed out. His voice was low, lacking any of the biting sarcasm he usually employed. It was the same soft, devastating tone he had used when he confessed he missed her. He shifted slightly on the sofa. The movement caused the thick wool of his sweater to brush against her arm. Hermione suppressed a shiver. He wasn't freezing anymore. The ambient temperature in the lab was perfectly normal, and the skin she could see at his wrists wasn't that sickly, translucent white. The color was slowly returning to him. He was healing. She finally looked up from the runic text. He was watching her. He had a large, leather-bound journal resting on his knees, but his eyes were entirely fixed on her face. The shadows under his eyes seemed less prominent tonight. "I'm reviewing the foundational theory," she said, trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism. "We need to understand exactly what you were trying to accomplish before we can decode the memory we pulled yesterday. We know what I was trying to accomplish," he said. He closed the journal on his knees with a soft thud. "I was trying to map the temporal decay." "But why?" Hermione pushed, turning her body slightly toward him. Their knees brushed. Neither of them moved away. The Ministry didn't commission that research. The Unspeakables consider the veil entirely off-limits for tampering. It's a static anomaly. You were doing this off the books. Draco frowned, looking down at the closed journal. "I don't know," he admitted. The frustration in his voice was clear. The memory, or the dark? The whispers. It felt like a trap, but it didn't feel like a trap I walked into blindly. It felt like I was looking for something specific. "We need to look at the arithmancy again," she said. She reached across him to grab a loose sheet of parchment from the low table in front of them. As she reached, her arm brushed against his chest. Draco's breath hitched slightly. Hermione froze, her hand hovering over the table. She turned her head. Her face was incredibly close to his. She could see the faint pulse beating at the base of his throat. "Sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he said immediately. His eyes locked onto hers. The grey in his irises was intense, completely clear of the cloudy panic that had haunted him since he returned. Hermione swallowed hard. The electric tension in the room spiked, becoming almost unbearable. She grabbed the parchment and quickly pulled back, settling against the cushions. She forced herself to look at the numbers. "Look at this," she said, her voice shaking slightly. She pointed to a string of complex equations near the bottom of the page. "These aren't mapping equations. They're structural. You weren't trying to observe the veil." Draco leaned over, looking at the parchment in her hands. His shoulder pressed firmly against hers. "Structural?" he repeated, his brow furrowing as he studied his own handwriting. "Yes," she said, her analytical mind finally taking over the panic of his proximity. "Look at the runic anchors you incorporated here. Answers. Iwars. These are stabilization runes. You were calculating the exact magical density required to build a framework." Draco studied the numbers. His breathing was shallow. "I was trying to build a door," he said softly. Hermione blinked in shock. She looked at him. "A door? The veil isn't a one-way gateway," he said. The realization was washing over him, bright and undeniable. That's why the Ministry couldn't understand it. They thought it was an execution chamber, an end point. But it's not. It's a tear in the fabric of the magic itself. And you were trying to stabilize the tear, she finished, the sheer scale of the magic making her dizzy. You were trying to create a two-way passage, to see if someone could come back. That's why I survived. He breathed, turning fully toward her. His eyes were wide, shining with the adrenaline of the breakthrough. "I didn't just fall, Hermione. I anchored myself. I used the equations. I built a structural tether before I went in. You did it on purpose, she whispered, the horror and the awe warring in her chest. I had to prove it could be done, he said. The magnitude of what he had accomplished was staggering. He had beaten the veil of death. He had rewritten the fundamental laws of magical theory, entirely on his own, just to prove a point. Hermione couldn't speak. She just looked at him, completely overwhelmed by the brilliant, reckless, impossible man sitting next to her. Draco was looking at her with the exact same intensity. The adrenaline of the discovery was high, vibrating in the air between them. The space between them seemed to vanish entirely. He didn't hesitate this time. He raised his hand. His long fingers brushed against her cheek, unbelievably gentle. He tucked a stray curl behind her ear, his thumb lingering on the soft skin of her jaw. The air went completely still. Hermione's breath caught in her throat. Her heart was hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. His eyes dropped to her lips. He leaned in. It wasn't the hesitant, panicked movement from the night before. This was deliberate. This was certain. He wasn't retreating into the cold. He was anchoring himself entirely in her warmth. Hermione leaned forward, her eyes fluttering shut. She could feel his breath against her skin. They were a fraction of an inch away. The heavy iron door to the lab swung open with a resounding, metallic crash. Granger, I swear to Merlin, if you've locked me out again, I will. Hermione and Draco sprang apart so fast that Draco's journal clattered loudly to the floor. Theo Knott stood in the doorway. He was holding two large, steaming cups of coffee from the ministry cafeteria. He stopped dead, taking in the scene. Draco was sitting rigidly against the arm of the sofa, a faint flush creeping up his pale neck. Hermione was gripping the edge of the parchment so tightly it was crinkling, her face burning. Theo didn't apologize. He didn't look embarrassed. Instead, a slow, absolutely wicked smirk spread across his face. Well, Theo drawled, his voice echoing loudly in the sudden silence of the lab. Are you two going to kiss? Or should I come back with popcorn? Because the UST is ruining my archives. The scrolls are literally damp with it. Not, I will actually murder you. Draco snapped, his voice rough. You're welcome to try, Theo said, completely unfazed. He strolled into the lab, the heavy iron door swinging shut behind him. He walked over to the desk and set the 2 cups of coffee down with a deliberate thud. But you'll have to find a new archivist, and we both know the ministry is terribly short-staffed right now. Hermione pressed her fingertips to her burning cheeks, trying to steady her breathing. Thank you for the coffee, Theo. Don't thank him. Draco muttered, dragging a hand down his face. He's a menace. I am a delight, Theo corrected. He leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms and watching them with an expression of deep, entirely unapologetic amusement. And I'm also the only person keeping you too caffeinated enough to solve the greatest magical mystery of the century. So, you know. Respect the supplier. Draco groaned, letting his head fall back against the wall. Hermione looked over at him. He was completely exasperated. He looked annoyed, tired, and entirely put upon. But as she watched him, she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. He was smiling. It wasn't a smirk. It wasn't the defensive, arrogant curve of his lips he used to hide behind. It was a real, genuine smile, small but undeniable, pulling at the corners of his mouth. The cold of the veil was entirely gone from his eyes. Theo noticed it, too. His smirk softened into something surprisingly fond before he pushed off the desk. "Right," Theo said, clapping his hands together once. "I'll leave you to your structural equations. Please try to keep the snogging to a professional minimum. This is a ministry laboratory, after all. Get out." Draco said, though the threat was completely ruined by the quiet laugh that escaped him. Theo offered a mock salute and strolled out of the lab, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The silence settled back over the room. It wasn't heavy anymore. The electric tension had broken, replaced by something much softer. Something warm and incredibly easy. Draco turned his head to look at her. He didn't move back into her space. He just watched her, the genuine smile still lingering on his face. "He's the worst person I've ever met," Draco said softly. "He brought coffee," Hermione pointed out, picking up the fallen journal from the floor and setting it on the table. "He ruined the moment," Draco countered, his voice dropping into that low, devastating register again. Hermione felt her cheeks flush again. She didn't look away from him. "There will be other moments," she said quietly. Draco's smile widened slightly. He reached out, his fingers brushing briefly against hers before he picked up his coffee cup. "Yeah," he agreed softly. "There will." 1 week later, Draco stood in the small, warmly lit kitchen of Hermione's flat, waiting for the kettle to boil. He wasn't wearing the oversized, dark wool sweater. For the first time in 11 months, he wasn't shivering. He was wearing a simple, fitted black button-down with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The unnatural, sickly pallor had completely faded from his skin, replaced by a healthy, though still pale, complexion. The shadows under his eyes were entirely gone. He was warm. The silence in his head was still absolute, but it wasn't the deafening, terrifying void of the veil anymore. It was just quiet. It was peaceful. The frantic whispers that had haunted his every waking moment since he returned had faded into nothingness, leaving him with a profound, unbroken stillness. He had spent the last week actively testing it, waiting for the cold to creep back in during the early hours of the morning, waiting for the panic to seize his lungs when he walked into an unlit room. It hadn't happened. The fracture in his mind had finally sealed shut. The kettle whistled. He reached out, his hand steady, and poured the boiling water into 2 ceramic mugs. He didn't use a wand. He didn't need to. He preferred the physical, grounding motion of doing it by hand. It was a tangible proof of his own existence in the real world. He added the tea leaves, letting them steep for exactly 3 minutes, before adding an entirely unreasonable amount of sugar to hers. He knew exactly how she took it, just as he knew exactly where she kept the mismatched spoons and which mug she preferred after a particularly grueling day at the ministry. The front door of the flat unlocked with a heavy click. "I'm home," Hermione called out. Her voice was muffled, sounding completely exhausted. Draco picked up the 2 mugs and walked out of the kitchen into the small living room. She was standing by the door, toeing off her sensible ministry heels. Her robes were rumpled, her hair was escaping its complicated twist, and she looked like she had been arguing with a brick wall for the last 10 hours. She had a heavy, leather-bound briefcase dangling from one hand, stuffed with reports and heavily redacted files. She looked up as he walked in. The absolute exhaustion melted off her face instantly. Her shoulders dropped, and a soft, genuine smile spread across her lips. "You're still here," she said quietly. "Where else would I be?" he asked. He walked across the room and handed her the obnoxiously sweet mug of tea. Hermione took it, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic. "I thought you might have gone back to the manor. Your mother sent me an owl this afternoon asking if you were eating properly. She seemed convinced you were starving in my frankly inadequate muggle kitchen." "My mother is a menace," Draco muttered, taking a sip of his own tea. "And the manor is too big. It's too quiet. The elves hover incessantly, and every room echoes. I prefer it here." It was an admission he would have choked on a year ago, but now it was just a simple, absolute truth. He preferred the cramped, book-stuffed flat. He preferred the crooked stacks of academic journals that threatened to topple over if someone walked by too quickly. He preferred the smell of parchment and vanilla. He preferred her. Hermione smiled, taking a sip of the tea. She closed her eyes, letting out a long, happy sigh as the sugar hit her system. "How was the Department of Mysteries?" he asked, leaning back against the arm of the sofa and watching her. "Maddening." She groaned, opening her eyes. She walked over and sank into the cushions, pulling her legs up underneath her. She set her briefcase heavily on the floor. The unspeakables are furious. The Committee for Experimental Charms is terrified. The minister wants to classify the entire project and bury the findings under 50 years of red tape. "Let them," Draco said dismissively. "I don't care about the politics, Granger. I don't care if they classify it or burn it. We proved the theory." "We did," she agreed softly, tracing the rim of her mug with her thumb. They had spent the last week finalizing the structural equations, cross-referencing the memory they had pulled from the pensieve with the raw data he had left behind in his chaotic notes. They had worked late into the night, sitting side by side on her sofa, poring over the math until their eyes burned. They had proven, mathematically and magically, that the veil wasn't a one-way execution chamber. It was a tear. And with the right structural anchors, it could be propped open. He had done it. He had walked into the void, anchored his magic to the physical world, and walked back out. But the victory wasn't in the math. The victory was in the fact that he was sitting in her living room, perfectly whole, drinking tea while she complained about bureaucratic red tape. He set his mug down on the low wooden table. He didn't sit on the opposite end of the sofa. He walked around the table and sat directly next to her, closing the distance between them until his thigh pressed against hers. Hermione didn't pull away. She leaned into him, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. Her voice was muffled against his shirt. "I am," he said. He meant it. For the first time since he had woken up freezing on the shore of the Black Lake, the statement was entirely true. "The cold is gone. The whispers are gone. I feel normal. Or as close to normal as I've ever been. I know." She murmured. She turned her head slightly, her breath warming the skin at his collar. "The healers officially signed off on your recovery this morning. They were stunned. They thought the neural pathways would never fully rebuild. They underestimated the quality of my medical care," Draco said, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "I'm not a healer, Malfoy," she pointed out, though he could hear the smile in her voice. "No," he agreed. "You're much better. You're far more stubborn. I couldn't just let you sit in a warded room for the rest of your life," she said softly, the amusement fading from her tone. "I couldn't stand the thought of you disappearing into the dark again after you fought so hard to come back." Draco shifted his weight, turning slightly toward her. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. The words were quiet, but they hung in the air, heavy with everything they had been through over the last few weeks. Hermione pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her brown eyes were incredibly soft. The fierce, uncompromising unspeakable was completely gone, replaced by the woman who had sat on the floor of a freezing ministry corridor and stubbornly refused to let him drown. "You would have figured it out," she said. "You're brilliant, Draco. You built the structural tethers. You survived the initial impact." "No," Draco corrected instantly, his voice firm and absolutely certain. "I wouldn't have. I built the door, Hermione. But you're the reason I walked back through it. You're the reason I held on." Her breath hitched. The electric tension that had been hovering between them since the near miss in the lab a week ago abruptly returned. But it wasn't frantic or panicked. It was a heavy, inevitable gravitational pull. There were no interruptions waiting for them here. There was no Theo to barge in with coffee, no healers to check his vitals, no unspeakables demanding answers. It was just the two of them. Draco didn't hesitate. He didn't second-guess himself. He didn't worry that he was crossing a line, because the line had been completely obliterated days ago. He reached up, his long fingers threading into the messy curls at the nape of her neck. His thumb brushed along her jawline, a gentle, anchoring motion. Hermione's eyes fluttered shut. She tilted her head into his touch, a quiet, surrendered movement that sent a surge of heat straight to his chest. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a desperate, crushing collision. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was incredibly soft. The moment his lips pressed against hers, the last lingering ghost of the veil completely vanished. There was no cold. There was no suffocating dark. There was only the overwhelming, absolute warmth of her mouth, the smell of vanilla, and the solid reality of her hands moving to grip his shoulders. Hermione kissed him back immediately. She shifted her weight, turning her body fully toward him. She tangled one hand in his hair, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss with a quiet, breathless sound that made his heart hammer against his ribs. Draco wrapped his free arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He dragged her fully into his lap, not wanting a single inch of space between them. The kiss shifted. It lost its gentle hesitation, burning into something much more intense. He kissed her fiercely, his mouth slanting over hers, tasting the sickeningly sweet tea on her tongue. It was a physical claiming, a desperate need to absolutely confirm that this was real, that he was here, and that the nightmare was definitively over. Hermione practically melted against him. She slid both arms around his neck, holding onto him with the same fierce, stubborn determination she used to anchor him in the dark. They stayed like that for a long time, entirely lost in the quiet, absolute heat of the kitchen. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily. Draco didn't let her go. He kept his arms wrapped tightly around her waist, his forehead resting against hers. He opened his eyes. She was looking at him. Her lips were swollen, her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes were bright and entirely present. Draco smiled. It was a real, unshielded smile, reaching all the way to his eyes. He didn't just survive the veil. He actually came home. The end.